Good evening. Me and Betty have to get used to doing this. Jake used to do it, so now we're going to have to tape with her old phone. So bear with us. It's good to see you. Oh, and Betty wanted me to tell you, she's got a little sore throat, so if she's not shaking everybody's hand and stuff, don't feel offended or anything. But everybody stay well out there. The title of our lesson tonight, what we're going to talk about, is the truth about modesty. I know a lot of us are old in here, and this isn't a problem we all have. But I think this is a topic that needs to be taught definitely across this country and the Church of Christ. And I think perhaps it hasn't been taught enough. And given any specifics with how do we dress modestly. I got this lesson outline from the World Video Bible School, lesson by Don Blackwell. You could type it in and pretty much get the same outline we're going to talk about tonight. But you can take this with you and go show people God's standard on how we ought to clothe ourselves and beware of pursuing lust and things of that nature. So I thought it was a very good lesson. I agreed with it. I thought it was biblical. So this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So this is a question that we all face every single day of our lives, no matter who you are. What am I going to wear? What am I going to wear today? There are several factors that help us answer this question. Number one, what am I going to be doing today? I'm not going to be wearing a suit and tie if I'm going to go out and do yard work. Number two, another factor is the weather. Right? Well, I'm not going to be wearing short sleeves outside with no coat if it's snowing outside, so the weather is a factor. But there's another factor that we all need to consider every single time that we go to our closet, and that is the modesty factor. And so, is this attire something acceptable to wear in God's eyes? I think it's a very important topic for us to talk about nowadays. If you've been to the mall recently, turned on the television, looked at billboards as you've driven down the highway, checked your Facebook feed, whatever it is, then you know that our country has a serious problem with the way we clothe ourselves. Sexual attraction is the way of the day when it comes to the clothing lines. And it would certainly be an understatement to say that this world is confused in regard to how we should clothe ourselves. I want to start having you notice this illustration, a cartoon that illustrates this idea. In the cartoon, the doorbell rings, and the girl on the left says, "Oh no, that's the doorbell, and here I am in my underclothes, right? I'm not decent." And then the other girl, who's actually wearing far less, says, "Oh, I'm dressed. I'll get it." Right? I like the cartoon because it really illustrates very well how confused our society is with regard to the clothing issue. It's really gotten to the point where people are not even embarrassed anymore by the exposure of their bodies. As a matter of fact, the exposure of bodies nowadays it's encouraged in this society. In Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 15, Jeremiah says that the people of his day had lost their ability to blush. The text says, "Were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, nor did they know how to blush." Right? That's what you do when you get embarrassed. You blush. You feel embarrassed about it. And that's really the world that we live in. It's just like that today. Many people have lost their ability to blush over the exposure of their bodies. Things that used to embarrass a person 50 or 60 years ago is completely acceptable nowadays, and it doesn't even faze people anymore in our society. A man in his 70s once said that when he was young, girls blushed when they were ashamed, but now they're ashamed when they blush. Now let me read that again. Girls blushed when they were ashamed, but now they're ashamed when they blush. And really that's what society is teaching our young people. Don't you feel ashamed of your body, to show off your body? Boys and girls alike, right? One preacher said, I would like to find what kind of fruit Adam and Eve ate to help them realize that they were naked, because I'd like to pass it around again. I think that's right. And it's definitely clear that in today's world, we need to have people open their eyes and realize what nakedness is, and what's appropriate to wear and what's not appropriate to wear. And it's something we need to be conscious of. As Christians, when we teach our young people and when we go out into the world and evangelize, this is a topic that definitely needs to be addressed sometime. No pun intended. But a Christian isn't like the world, right? A Christian cannot be like the world. We're different. We've been called out of the world. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15 says, "Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." Many times when we get into these clothing fashions and do what the world's doing, it's because that's the pressure that's being given. Everyone's wearing the same thing, doing the same thing, saying the same thing. Well, we need to step out and be different. What does Romans chapter 12 and verse 2 say? It says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." But very sadly, this problem of immodesty or lack of clothing has affected Christians, and sometimes it creeps into the Lord's church. There are some places where men don't want to serve on the Lord's table because young women are dressed immodestly in the worship. Or you hear of some wives who will tell their husbands that they don't want them to teach the teenagers because of what some of the teenage girls are wearing. Right? So sometimes it can creep into the church. And this is a very unpleasant subject to teach about, especially in a teen classroom, right? Sometimes it's embarrassing both for the one teaching it and for the hearers. And sometimes those who like to dress immodestly get very angry and upset because they feel like they're being singled out and insulted. Sometimes people will try to accuse the teacher of having a dirty mind for talking about this subject. So therefore, because of the awkwardness that often comes along with the subject, some have just avoided the topic altogether. Right? We're just not going to talk about that subject. They feel like it's not worth the grief. But if we're going to be pleasing to God, we have got to talk about this subject and address every area of the Christian life, and this is one of them. Amen. So whether or not we want to admit it, when a woman goes out into public in something like a modern day swimsuit, or short shorts, or short skirt, or having the midsection exposed, some of those crop top things, or wearing clothes that are too tight, things of that nature, she's actually doing something that is sinful, right? Something that violates God's law. And we'll talk about the man. Don't worry, we'll get to the man later. But we're talking about the women. What essentially is taking place when that happens, with the bikini, with this wear and that wear, is she's taking the sexual impulses that God has instilled in every man, right, put there by God to draw husbands and wives closer together, and she is corrupting those impulses and allowing them to be cheapened. And what do I mean by that? Well, that's not what those impulses were designed for in the man, right? It was not God's plan for men to be drawn closer to just any woman who was exposing herself or choosing to do so. But those natural impulses that God put there were designed for a man to be drawn closer to his wife. And that's the whole point. So therefore, when a woman willingly, and there's the key, willingly exposes her nakedness as to allow men to see, men who are not her husband, right? She is doing something that is sinful. So why is it the case that man is so sexually impressed by the woman? We must understand it's not an accident. It really is not. The fact is that God designed men that way. And why did he do that? Well, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 says, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." The reason man is impressed by and sexually attracted to woman is because of God's design. Right? But there is a very big difference between the physical attraction between a husband and a wife and the physical attraction between a man and some stranger on the beach, or someone by the pool, or someone at the mall. Right? Listen to what the Old Testament says, very straightforward, about the physical attraction of a husband and a wife. Proverbs chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. "Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of your youth. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breasts satisfy you at all times, and always be enraptured with her love." Right, so that's the way God describes the husband and the wife relationship. Now listen to the difference between now a man and a wife who are not married. What did Jesus say? Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. "But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So some might try to rationalize and say, well, as long as nothing physical happens, there's nothing wrong with it, right? And we all have heard this argument before. It's all right to look, you just can't touch, right? But that's not right. And that's not what Jesus said here, not at all. The Bible teaches that God is concerned not only with our actions, but also with our minds and our hearts and the things that we're thinking. In Job chapter 31 and verse 1, Job made the statement, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? He made an agreement with his eyes. I'm not going to look upon a young woman. He understood that even to look upon a young woman with lust in his heart was sinful. All right? So with all of this in mind, I think it's safe to say that properly clothing ourselves is a very important topic to think about. Now, I want in this lesson to list some considerations for all of us, and we can take it into the world, take it to our children, we're teaching guidelines to help us in knowing how we ought to dress ourselves and adorn ourselves. So the first consideration should always be what God said on the subject, right? God's law. And some people will say, well, the Bible doesn't tell us how to dress. And, in a sense, they're right? It never says, the shirts can't be this low, or the shorts can't be this high, or this, that. Well, but it's not entirely true. Right? The Bible does tell us how we ought to clothe ourselves. Some of it's very specific. Some of it's found in principle. But the Bible does give us some guidelines that we can think about. And that's what I want to present in this lesson. I want to begin all the way back at the very beginning. Back in the Garden of Eden. Okay, first story we read about. Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, the Bible says about Adam and Eve, that they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now, why were they not ashamed? Well, because apparently they weren't aware of the fact that they were naked. But after they ate of the forbidden fruit, what happens? Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7 says, then the eyes of them both were open, and they knew that they were naked. Right? They realized their condition, that they did not have clothes on. And what did they do? The text says they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. Now the King James Version uses the word aprons. Now this is an interesting word. Okay, they made themselves aprons, and this word is defined as a girdle or a loincloth. Now that's what the word means. You can probably picture Tarzan, right, wearing his loincloth. That's what we're talking about. One version says they made themselves loin coverings. That's the meaning of the word. Another version says they covered themselves around the hips. But what's very interesting is that the clothing that they made, when they covered themselves with these little aprons, these loin coverings, well, it was apparently not sufficient, was it? Because in Genesis chapter 3, verse 21, the Bible says, also for Adam and his wife, the Lord made tunics of skin and clothed them. Right? So this word is a little bit different than the loincloth, right? The word tunics of skin here means a long shirt-like garment, a robe, a garment that started at the shoulders and flowed down like a long skirt. Or a long shirt, sorry. No, it is skirt. Yeah, that's the right word. Mm-hmm. Now, I want you to think about the difference here. Okay, Adam and Eve, they made themselves loin coverings, right? Clothing covered around the hips. But when the Lord went to clothe them and properly put clothing on them, he made them robes. Right? Garments that started at the shoulders and covered them likely down towards their knee area. And, so Adam and Eve, they basically made themselves coverings comparable to underwear, right? And that wasn't acceptable to just continue wearing that, or comparable to very short shorts, right? But God gave them something that covered everything from the shoulders probably down to past the thighs, past the knees. So the implication seems to be that by simply covering the loins, it was not sufficient covering in God's sight. Now apply that to our clothing issue. You're going out to the beach, you're going out with the short shorts. Simply covering the loins isn't enough to cover up your nakedness. That's interesting. They were not adequately covered by just doing that. And notice that when God came into the garden, after Adam and Eve had made themselves these loin coverings, Adam still made the statement in Genesis 3 verse 10, I was naked and I hid myself. Well, you had fig leaves covering you around your loins, Adam, and you're still saying, I hid because I was naked. And God doesn't argue with him, does he? He said, well, who told you that you were naked? Genesis 3:11. So I think it goes to show you that nakedness, right, the word nakedness doesn't just refer to being 100% unclothed. I think that's the wrong idea that the world has. Oh, I'm not naked. Well, yeah, you are. In the eyes of God, right? But Adam and Eve were showing nakedness even when they were covered around the loins. So that's interesting. Secondly, let's deal with another passage that deals with this principle. Exodus chapter 28 This section of Scripture is looking at and is dealing with the priestly garments under the law of Moses, right? When they were making the Levites' garments. Verse 40 says, "For Aaron's sons you shall make tunics, and you shall make sashes for them, and you shall make hats for them, for glory and beauty. You shall put them on Aaron your brothers and on his sons with him. You shall anoint them, consecrate them, and sanctify them, that they may minister to me as priests." Now listen carefully to verse 42, the very next verse. It says, "And you shall make for them linen trousers to cover up their nakedness. They shall reach from the waist to the thighs." Now notice that phrase, okay? They shall reach from the waist to the thighs. One version puts it this way: they shall reach from the hips to the knee. Right? And it sounds to me like a long pair of shorts. A piece of clothing that would not only cover their loins, as Adam and Eve had done, but something that would cover much farther than that, down to their thighs. And what was the purpose? What was the purpose of this garment? The text says to cover their nakedness. Thomas Eves, in his tract on Modesty, wrote, "In the Old Testament, it was considered nakedness when one had his thighs uncovered." And he cited this verse as proof. So it's an interesting principle. We need to be careful in binding these things, but I think it's something we can learn from. And so let's take a look at what we have so far. You know, with how the Bible describes covering nakedness by those two passages we looked at. You know, in order to be adequately covered, what do we see? A garment started at the shoulders and it went down to the knees. That's the area we're talking about. If you want a visual, that's what we're looking at. And I'd say that's a pretty easy guideline. You know, you can't go wrong with that. You can't go wrong with always just keeping yourselves covered from your shoulders down to your knees. If we could just end right there, I think that'd be perfect. And being aware of that, of how much skin, how much is being seen in that section. But what does the world like to do? Right? Well, they try to get as close to that line of nakedness as they possibly can. Right, where is it? You know, is it the knee? Is it 2 inches above the knee? You know, where is it? Well, what does the world do? They push the boundaries as far as they can get it, and the shorts get shorter. The clothing gets smaller and shorter, and again smaller, and even smaller. And you know, it's all up until about 5 to 10% of the body. Everything else is exposed, except for that small percentage. And they say, "Oh, I'm covered, covering my nakedness." But you see, when God covered up nakedness, here's the principle I'm just pointing out. We see His pattern. He clothed from the shoulders to the knees. That's the pattern we see. And so, you know, could this be this pattern? You know, it's obviously smart. It's obviously wise to do this. Could it not be because that's where the attraction from the opposite sex is located, is within those areas? That's the areas that we need to be careful of showing to this world? I think so. I think that's the idea. So, you know, a Christian who is seeking to please God will not be seeking to push those boundaries as far as possible. That's not the attitude we want to have. Rather, they will be trying their best to be aware of that region of the body and keep that region covered as best as they can. You know, by the way, would this also not be a good guideline to help men with where their eyes ought to be? Right? Men should not be gazing upon or studying any area on a woman who's not their wife within that region. You know, our goal should be to keep our eyes and our thoughts off of that area. And again, I think that's a good guideline. You can't go wrong with it. I think we would all agree there. So a third passage I want us to notice about this topic is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. So Paul says, "In like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women, professing godliness with good works." There are 3 things I want you to notice in this passage. First thing is the word modest. Okay? The word modest here means orderly, well-arranged, or decent. The idea is that she is to adorn herself or beautify herself in a way as to not draw undue attention to herself. Right? Look over here, look over here. in the immediate context, Paul is actually discussing women who are overdoing it, right? That she's overdressing, flashy clothes, a lot of makeup, expensive jewelry, getting people's attention to look at her. But you know, there's another way in which a woman could draw undue attention to herself, and that's by underdoing it, right? That's by wearing too little, wearing clothes that are too tight, too low, too short, too thin, too revealing. And a godly woman is commanded not to dress in such a way as to draw undue attention to herself, but she is to dress decently. The second word I want to notice is the word propriety. The King James Version uses the word shamefacedness. And this word propriety is actually closer to our modern day word modest than the other one. And the word propriety here means a sense of shame. The godly woman is to have a sense of shame about her modesty, used in regard with demeanor of women in the church. Now the third phrase is found in verse 10. Paul talks about that which is proper for women professing godliness. Okay, so let me introduce one more thing and then we'll put all this together. Titus chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Paul says that the older women are to teach the younger women to be chaste. Okay, and that word means pure from carnality, modest, perfect, innocent. Right? That's what the women are striving for. So let's put all that together. A godly woman is to dress in such a way as to not draw undue attention to herself. She should have a sense of shame or modesty about her in the way she clothes herself. She should be innocent, pure from carnality or sensuality, and she should dress as a woman whose most important thing in this life is to be pleasing to God. Right? So, I'm very sad to say that the modern day swimwear does not fit this description, does not fit this definition. And a person who wants to be pleasing to the Lord has no business being out in public in those modern day swimsuits, right? And that would, I believe, would include the bikini and the one piece. You know, sometimes you say, I don't want a swimsuit, but you know, we're talking about the loin area a lot. I think sometimes the one piece exposes just as much or more of the loins as the bikini does. Some of them are even worse. What about the cut-off shirts that expose the midsection and the stomach? Doesn't fit this definition of modest. Most modern-day cheerleading uniforms don't even remotely come close to this definition of modesty. And a large deal of athletic wear and sporting clothes from both men and women, form-fitting attire that clings tightly to the body, does not fit this description. Right? And here's a very important principle that the world needs to understand. You know, a sporting event, I wish I could go back and talk about this in college, maybe even tell myself, a sporting event does not change immodest into modest. A wedding does not change immodest into modest. Being near water does not change immodest into modest. Not even hot weather changes immodest into modest. Well, it was hot outside. Well, you're still half naked. You know, so you might be saying in this lesson, well, Travis, you are talking an awful lot about the women. Isn't modesty applicable to the man? Why aren't you talking about the man? And my answer is it certainly is. It is completely applicable to the man. All the same concepts would apply, but I just want to point out something interesting. You know, when you read the Bible, generally, the principles of modesty are directed at women. And passages prohibiting lust are applied typically to the men. Now, is that because the women never lust? Or is that because modesty doesn't apply to the men? In both cases, the answer is no. But I think it's really telling of how we were both designed, both of the genders. Lust is generally a bigger problem for the man than it is for the woman. But yes, all of the principles of modesty that we've been talking about would apply to the man as well. If a man goes out into public with his shirt buttoned halfway down his chest, exposing all of that, wearing no shirt at all at the beach, wearing skin-tight leggings or pants and short shorts, same thing applies for the man. So he is equally doing something that is sinful, and no doubt something that could be a stumbling block for a woman. So men need to be very careful as well. So that leads us into our second main point in this lesson. The first consideration with regards to our clothing is always to be God's law, what God said, when I'm considering what to wear. Well, what about this factor? Other people. We need to consider every time we put clothing on other people. What do I mean by that? If I'm attempting to live in a godly way that is pleasing to Him, then I don't want to do anything that would cause somebody else to sin. I don't want to put a stumbling block in somebody else's path. And it is the case that the way I clothe myself can be a stumbling block for other people that can lead them into sin. Right? Consider what Jesus said that we read earlier in Matthew 5. I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So do you realize that I can commit a sin in my mind that can cause me to lose my soul? Right? And that's exactly what the Lord is saying in this passage. Now with that in mind, when I'm purchasing my clothing, whoever I am, I need to be thinking about other people. I need to be thinking about what effect this clothing is going to have on them. One author wrote, the leading fashion designers admit that the reason behind short skirts and bare skin is to seduce the men. And they outright came out and said, that's why we designed them that way, right? And they put the logos on the bottom of the pants to draw the attention there. And Christians certainly don't want to be doing that, causing other people to turn their head. Listen to Luke chapter 17, verse 1. Then Jesus said to his disciples, it is impossible that no offenses should come. Right? Offenses are going to come, but woe to him through whom they do come. One version says, how terrible for him through whom they come. Right? So I don't ever want to be the cause of another person stumbling. I think we could have a whole lesson about verses in that regards. And if I willfully put a stumbling block in my brother or sister's way, or I just say, I don't care about that, I transgress God's law in that nature too. Some years ago, there was a survey that was done. This is pretty interesting among high school boys, and they were asked a few